Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining me because today we're setting off on a journey into the incredibly brutal and often heartbreaking origins of modern American workplace rights. We often take the structure of our working lives completely for granted, you know? But the foundation of the American economy was really forged in a crucible of blood, sweat, and ultimately massive reform. So let's dive right in. Think about your typical work week for a second. What did it actually cost to build the modern American economy? I really want you to keep that question in the back of your mind as we go through this explainer. The comforts of today's workplace, things like having weekends off, safety standards, an 8-hour day, literally none of these were just freely handed over by the massive corporations of the Gilded Age and the early Progressive era. They had to be fought for, tooth and nail, and the cost was extraordinarily high. To truly understand that cost, just let this shocking number sink in. 35,000. In the year 1900 alone, that was the estimated annual death toll of industrial workers in the United States, 35,000 people. And it gets worse, because that's just the fatalities. Another 500,000 workers were permanently injured or disabled that same year. There were essentially no safety nets, no workers' compensation, and zero federal regulations protecting the men, women, and children who were quite literally fueling the nation's rapid industrialization.
All right, let's get into Act 1, the human cost of industry.
The reality on the ground across all different sectors was just incredibly grim. Imagine working in a textile mill, breathing in thick dust amid deafening noise for 11 to 12 hours straight. Or picture being deep underground in a coal mine for up to 14 hours, making a measly 50 to 60 cents a day. Then there were the canneries, running 18-hour shifts where children as young as 3 or 4 acted as helpers, lugging around 40-pound boxes. The conditions were universally grueling. The standard work week was 60 hours or more, and for all that backbreaking labor, average factory wages were barely $600 a year. That was well below the poverty line.
Moving right along to Act 2, scientific management and sweatshops.
Around this time, we see a stark contrast between two huge systems that basically revolutionized manufacturing. On one side, we have Taylorism, also known as scientific management. This system broke tasks down into tiny, highly specialized, and extremely repetitive segments. On the other side, Fordism introduced the mechanized assembly line to achieve mass production. Now, while both of these systems yielded absolute leaps in productivity and really gave rise to modern mass consumption, they had a dark side. They essentially reduced the human worker to a highly standardized, de-skilled cog within a massive industrial machine. This whole obsession with efficiency manifested as something called stopwatch management. Managers would literally stand there and time workers to shave mere seconds off repetitive tasks. So what does this all mean? Well, this relentless quest for speed led to extreme physical and mental exhaustion. Workers were pushed to the absolute brink. And when they inevitably faltered or literally fell asleep on their feet from exhaustion, the discipline was severe. Supervisors were actually known to douse sleeping workers with cold water or even beat them with leather straps, just to keep the line moving.
And the victims of this brutal system weren't just adults. Take Carmela Tioli, for example. She was just 14 years old when a cotton twisting machine caught her hair and horribly pulled her scalp off. She spent 7 months in the hospital. The company paid her medical bills, sure, but they outright denied her any sick pay. Grounding these massive, sweeping statistics in the emotional reality of children like Carmela really exposes just how horrific and widespread child labor was at the time.
Act 3, tragedies that sparked change. You know, before we saw sweeping labor laws, the status quo was actually first shattered by muckraking journalists. Take Upton Sinclair. In his 1906 novel, The Jungle, he exposed the completely horrific, diseased conditions inside Chicago's meatpacking plants. And while the workers themselves were often surviving on incredibly simple meals, like just bread and molasses, the resulting public outrage over tainted meat really shifted the conversation. It birthed the Pure Food and Drug Act. So this movement for pure food wasn't just about the workers anymore. It became a fight for the health and safety of the entire nation, and it set the stage for a much wider reckoning. But the workplace itself was still a powder keg, and one of the most infamous tragedies happened on March 25, 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in Manhattan. This was a busy garment factory producing women's blouses, and it was staffed mostly by young Jewish and Italian immigrant women. We're talking about women working 14-hour days for roughly $6 a week, packed into incredibly crowded, unsanitary spaces. When a fire broke out on the 8th floor right near closing time, the situation turned instantly fatal.
Why was it so deadly? Well, the main exit doors had actually been locked by the supervisors. This was a cruel but shockingly common practice meant to prevent unauthorized breaks and reduce theft. The building's single, flimsy fire escape completely collapsed under the weight of panicked workers. And to make matters worse, the fire department's ladders could only reach the 7th floor. That left the workers on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors entirely trapped. Trapped in the inferno, desperate workers were faced with an unimaginable choice, and many were forced to jump from the windows to the street below. In total, 146 immigrant workers perished that day. It was devastating. But their deaths were not entirely in vain. The sheer public horror of this event pushed the state of New York to pass more than 30 new workplace fire, safety, and health laws. It really sparked a massive shift toward actual state intervention.
Fast forward just 3 years later, and another horrific tragedy unfolded. This time out in the coal fields of Colorado, the Ludlow Massacre of April 1914. Coal miners had gone on strike, protesting incredibly dangerous conditions. We're talking toxic fumes and constant mine cave-ins, along with incredibly low pay. The retaliation from the mine owners was absolutely brutal. The striking miners were evicted from their company-owned homes, which forced them to set up tent camps just to survive. The Colorado National Guard was called in, supposedly to keep the peace, but they immediately sided with the mine owners. They surrounded the camp, opened fire with machine guns, and eventually burned the tent colony right to the ground. 25 people were killed. And the most heartbreaking part? Among the dead were 11 children and 2 women who suffocated in a pit they had frantically dug beneath their burning tent to hide from the bullets.
Which brings us to Act 4, the Workers Strike Back. As the labor movement organized, it kind of split into different factions with different strategies for tackling the massive power of these consolidated corporations. On one hand, you had the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. They really focused on skilled craft workers and pursued practical bread and butter goals, things like higher wages and shorter hours through collective bargaining. On the other hand, you had the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, famously known as the Wobblies. They were much more radical. They were all-inclusive, organizing unskilled laborers, women, and immigrants, and they pushed for fundamental, systemic changes to the entire economic structure. And we really see the power of this grassroots organizing in actions like the 1912 Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts, famously known as the Bread and Roses strike. To understand the desperate stakes here, a state law had actually reduced the work week by 2 hours, but in response, mill owners just slashed the workers' pay proportionately. For these starving immigrant workers, a 32-cent pay cut wasn't just some number on a ledger. To put it in perspective, that equaled 4 loaves of bread. It was literally the difference between life and death for their kids. But despite speaking over a dozen different languages, the workers united. They struck and sang together as a single, powerful voice.
Finally, Act 5, the legacy of reform.
The blood shed by these workers eventually translated into real, tangible federal law. This rapid succession of legislative victories beautifully maps a monumental shift in our country. In 1903, the Department of Commerce and Labor was created to investigate corporate practices. By 1908, the Federal Employers' Liability Act held companies accountable for worker injuries. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act explicitly protected unions from being prosecuted as monopolies. And by 1916, the Adamson Act established the 8-hour workday for railway workers. You can see the momentum here, right? The government went from sending in troops to bust up strikes to actually erecting legal protections for the working class. But the true culmination of decades of this brutal struggle was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This is the big one. This landmark legislation established a federal minimum wage, mandated the 40-hour work week, and finally put strict federal restrictions on child labor. And it's just incredibly fitting that this act was championed by Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins. Talk about a full circle moment. Years earlier, she had stood on the street in Manhattan and witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire with her own eyes. So, the next time you clock out after an 8-hour day or enjoy your weekend, remember, workplace safety and the end of widespread child labor weren't just gifts from benevolent corporations. They were paid for in blood, sweat, and relentless organizing. And it makes you wonder, as the nature of work continues to shift today with the gig economy and rapid automation, what modern workplace rights will the next generation have to fight for? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.